This is one of the reasons why, I've again, I mean, you get criticism for making this point, and largely at the moment from an increasingly conspiratorially inclined right. But I don't believe that the last year is simply some kind of prelude for democratic governments, coincidentally across the entire world, to fundamentally reprogram our species or something like that. I don't see it. I think there's all sorts of criticism. I think that we've made the economy too secondary in a discussion on the public health, for my taste. But again, if we had a mature political discussion in any of our countries, it would have involved, as you know, I've discussed this before in Aristotelian terms, to do with immigration, but I can do the same thing in relation to the pandemic, which is you have competing virtues of equal or almost equal seriousness. You have the public health and you have the economy. And for a time in all of our societies, we over-prioritize the public health perhaps and under-prioritize the economy. And if you don't have an economy, then at some point you don't have a public health system or anything like it. And you end up in the situation of a country where the poor and disadvantaged are much more likely to just die. And so...
Well, what we're doing is sacrificing long-term public health for short-term gains on the hospital front. And that's actually not surprising. Like, I've thanked my lucky stars many times in the last year that I'm not in a position to be making those decisions, because it must be hell. Absolutely. And we need to all step back and think, look, we might get lucky. There's a dozen vaccines that are making their way to market, and many that have already arrived. And a few months is a hell of a long time when you're living through it, but not very long time when you think about it in retrospect. And so if we're smart, we're going to ride this out.
And here's an example of where the whole thing can both be mended and can go awry. One thing I've tried to alert some people to in the last year has been, are we sure that, for instance, it's worth our GDPs crashing and our state borrowing soaring in this fashion for this virus? The answer might be yes. But if it's yes, then you have to be pretty sure that nothing like it's going to happen again. And I'm not at all sure of that. I'm not at all sure that, among other things, because the country that gave us this virus is led by a communist regime that has done everything it can to cover over how the virus came about. And so here's one of the risks we have in the era we're going into. The question of how to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again is likely to be subsumed and forgotten about, among other things, because a lot of energy is going to be expended by people in fruitless and conspiratorial pursuits, which will include conspiratorial pursuits against everyone in government in their respective countries. And we will lose the opportunity, for instance, to hold the CCP to account, or to make sure that they don't give us another virus like this in a couple of years' time, because we also know from this last year that we live in societies which are dominated by risk aversion and are highly litigious. I mean, many of the firms that will not come back because they were in fear that one employee might get the virus if they returned too early to the office and then sue their employer. For instance, all of these they're not the deepest problems in a society, but they're, in terms of the technocracy of a society, they are very serious problems and need addressing. I worry that we're going to address none of this because of energies expended in fruitless directions. And I wonder if we can't just somehow, again, come across ways to solve problems. And that can be done by trust being built across political divides.
Well, that's a big part of this, is that I would say if one piece of advice is to understand what you're sacrificing by continuing to support Trump under these conditions, another piece of advice would be to risk trust.
Yes.
At the present time.
Yes.
We've been through, in the West, we've been through crises of various sorts in the past and managed them quite successfully, all things considered. And you could point to the pandemic response and look at all the things that have been positive about it. The biggest of those being the dozen or so vaccines or more that are in the pipeline and that have been produced with unbelievable speed and apparent utility. And I'm praying that that's the case, knowing full well that, vaccinating 100 million people with a relatively unproven chemical is a dangerous enterprise. But I'm praying that it goes well. And I'm praying as well that trust, I've been thinking increasingly, I wrote about this in my book that's coming out in March, about trust as a form of courage, right? Rather than, because naive trust is useless, and anybody who's been hit is no longer naive, and so maybe no longer trusting, but you can replace that with a trust that's born out of courage. And if you manifest trust, even across a political divide, you call to the best in the person across that divide by saying, look, I'm willing to trust you, knowing full well that you're as big a snake as me. So that's what we need at the moment. And I'm hoping Biden well. He has a great burden, and I hope that he can be pragmatic and concentrate on the real problems. And